February 1991. Al-Khafji, Kuwait. The sound arrives first, a deep guttural roar that seems to come from the earth itself, rising through the smoke and chaos of burning oil fires and artillery impacts. Then the sight, an A-10 Thunderbolt Takibison, emerging from the haze at 300 feet. Wings level, impossibly slow, as if deliberately taunting the Iraqi gunners below. Captain Kim Campbell banks the aircraft into a turn, scanning the desert below, where Iraqi armored vehicles have American Marines pinned down. Tracer fire rises to meet her, glowing orange streams converging on her aircraft from multiple directions. She presses into the attack anyway, rolling wings level, pickle button pressed, the Gayu-8 Avenger cannon erupting with its distinctive growl as 30mm depleted uranium rounds tear into Iraqi positions at 70 rounds per second. The aircraft shudders with each burst, the recoil from the gun actually slowing her forward speed, the smoke from the cannon obscuring her forward vision. She pulls off target and begins a climbing turn, and that is when the world explodes around her cockpit. An Iraqi surface-to-air missile has detonated close enough to pepper the entire aft section of her aircraft with shrapnel, and suddenly the stick in her hand feels wrong, sluggish, unresponsive. The hydraulic pressure gauges drop to 0. Both hydraulic systems are gone. The flight controls should be frozen, the aircraft uncontrollable, spiraling toward the desert at 400 knots with no possibility of recovery. But Campbell does not eject. She will not abandon the Marines below who need her, will not surrender a $40 million aircraft to enemy territory, will not accept that she cannot bring this wounded machine home. What happens in the next hour will be studied in military academies for decades, analyzed by Soviet military observers who cannot believe what their intelligence reports tell them. Repeated in briefings to fighter pilots who struggle to comprehend how anyone survived what should have been catastrophic failure. To understand the profound impact Campbell's actions had on military observers, particularly those from nations that designed aircraft around completely different philosophies, one must first understand what the A-10 Warthog represented in American military doctrine. The aircraft was designed during the 1970s specifically to kill Soviet tanks in a European war scenario, to operate from rough forward airfields, to absorb tremendous punishment and continue fighting. Where Soviet ground attack aircraft emphasized speed and sophistication, the A-10 embraced simplicity and survivability. Its engines were mounted high and separated to minimize vulnerability to ground fire. Its cockpit was surrounded by 1,200 pounds of titanium armor that could withstand direct hits from 23mm cannon shells. Its control surfaces were massively redundant, with manual reversion capability that allowed pilots to fly the aircraft, using cables and pulleys if all hydraulics failed. Soviet aircraft designers found this philosophy almost offensive. Why design for failure when proper engineering should prevent failure? Why add weight for redundancy when weight reduced performance? The American answer, demonstrated repeatedly in combat, was that aircraft get hit, systems fail, and survival depends not on perfection, but on graceful degradation. Campbell's situation was beyond what even the A-10's designers had envisioned as survivable. With both hydraulic systems destroyed, she had no powered flight controls, no way to move the control surfaces through normal means. The manual reversion system that engineers had included almost as an afterthought, the system that Soviet observers considered evidence of American overcaution and inferior design confidence, was her only option. She switched to manual mode, and suddenly she was controlling a 30-ton aircraft through steel cables, pulleys, and physical force, fighting control pressures that made the wounded machine barely controllable. The stick required both hands. Trim changes demanded concentration. Every control input had to be precise because overcorrection was catastrophic, with no hydraulic damping to smooth her inputs. She flew like this for an hour, maintaining formation with her wingman, navigating back to friendly airspace, setting up an approach to Al Jaber Air Base in Kuwait, and executing a landing at nearly 200 knots on a runway that suddenly seemed impossibly narrow. The damage assessment after landing stunned maintenance crews. The entire aft section of the aircraft was shredded. Hydraulic lines were severed completely. Large sections of flight control surfaces were simply missing, torn away by the missile blast. The stabilizer jack screw that allowed trim adjustments had been damaged to the point that normal trim functions were inoperative. By every standard assessment, the aircraft should have been uncontrollable, should have entered an unrecoverable spin the moment hydraulic pressure was lost. That it remained flyable testified to the redundancy designed into every system, the structural integrity of an airframe built like a flying tank, the manual control system that Soviet engineers had dismissed as unnecessary weight. Campbell's ability to fly at home testified to something else entirely, a level of skill, determination, and tactical awareness that transcended normal military professionalism. Soviet military observers studying the incident through intelligence reports found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about their own design philosophy. Colonel General Pyotr Dynekin, who would later command the Russian Air Force, examined the damage photographs and technical analysis in classified briefings. His reaction, preserved in military archives released after the Soviet Union's collapse, captures the cognitive dissonance of watching American doctrine prove itself in ways Soviet theory said were impossible. We were taught that aircraft must be designed to optimal specifications, that redundancy was waste, that proper maintenance and tactics would prevent the scenarios Americans prepared for. This pilot flew a crippled aircraft that our doctrine said should have been abandoned. She completed her mission, protected ground forces, returned to base, and saved the aircraft. Our pilots are brave, but they are not trained to think survival is possible under such circumstances. Our aircraft are not designed to be survivable once primary systems fail. We have optimized for the battle we expect. The Americans have designed for the battle they cannot predict. The symbolic power of the control stick became central to how Campbell's story was told and retold in military circles. In normal operations, the A-10's stick moved easily, hydraulically boosted, requiring minimal pilot input. With hydraulics lost, that same stick became a direct mechanical link to the control surfaces, requiring enormous physical force to move. Campbell flew for over an hour with both hands on the stick, arms aching, fighting to maintain control through every moment. The stick that should have been frozen solid instead moved grudgingly, fighting her every input, responding only to sustained pressure and careful management. To Soviet pilots trained on aircraft where hydraulic failure meant immediate ejection, the idea of manually flying a jet aircraft in combat was beyond comprehension. Their training emphasized prevention of failures, not recovery from them. American training, particularly in the A-10 community, emphasized that aircraft get damaged, systems fail, and the mission continues until it is physically impossible to continue. The A-10's design philosophy had been controversial even within American military circles. During the 1970s and 1980s, many Air Force leaders argued for faster, more sophisticated aircraft. The A-10 was slow, ugly, built around a gun from an era when precision-guided munitions were making guns obsolete. Critics called it the Warthog, and the name stuck, initially as an insult, but gradually transforming into a badge of honor as the aircraft proved itself in combat. The Gulf War validated every controversial decision made during the A-10's design. Its ability to operate from rough fields meant it could base close to the front lines. Its redundancy meant it brought pilots home, even after taking damage that would destroy other aircraft. Its relatively simple systems meant maintenance crews could repair battle damage quickly and return aircraft to service. Soviet ground attack aircraft, like the Su-25, designed to similar specifications, emphasized speed and sophistication over survivability. They were faster, carried more modern avionics, looked more impressive in propaganda photographs, but they lacked the obsessive redundancy that American designers had built into every A-10 system. The recovery and analysis of Campbell's aircraft provided detailed evidence of what survivability engineering actually meant in practice. Maintenance crews found that the manual reversion system, a backup to a backup that many pilots had never even practiced using, had functioned exactly as designed, despite extensive damage to surrounding systems. The titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit had deflected shrapnel that would have killed the pilot in any other aircraft. The separated engine mounting meant that damage to one side of the aircraft did not affect the other engine. The redundant tail surfaces meant that even with portions of the stabilizer destroyed, enough control authority remained to fly the aircraft. Every design decision that critics had called excessive, every pound of weight devoted to protection and redundancy rather than performance, had proven its value. The aircraft had been hit by a missile designed to destroy aircraft, had lost primary and backup flight control systems, and had remained controllable enough to return to base. The training implications became apparent as the Air Force analyzed Campbell's actions and tried to understand what could be taught versus what was simply exceptional airmanship. Manual reversion procedures were already part of A-10 training, but they were typically practiced at high altitude with time to troubleshoot. Campbell had activated manual reversion in combat, at low altitude, over hostile territory, while maintaining situational awareness of threats and friendly positions. The physiological challenges alone were significant. Maintaining two-handed control of a heavy stick for over an hour while managing the psychological stress of combat and wounded aircraft was beyond what normal training prepared pilots for. The Air Force updated their training programs to emphasize not just manual reversion procedures, but the mental preparation required to accept that damaged aircraft could be saved, that ejection was not automatic, that mission completion might depend on flying a crippled machine beyond its designed limits. The psychological impact on Campbell herself became part of the story that circulated through military aviation communities. In interviews years later, she would describe the experience not as heroic, but as simply doing what the situation required. The possibility of ejection had occurred to her, but the Marines on the ground needed close air support. The aircraft was still flying, and giving up seemed wrong when continuation was possible. This attitude, that extraordinary effort was simply professional obligation, reflected a cultural difference between American and Soviet military approaches. Soviet doctrine emphasized central planning and perfect execution of predetermined tactics. American doctrine increasingly emphasized initiative and adaptation, training individuals to make decisions in chaotic situations rather than waiting for orders. Campbell's decision to continue flying a critically damaged aircraft was not explicitly authorized by any regulation or procedure. It was a judgment call based on assessment of the situation, capabilities, and mission requirements. Soviet observers studying the incident struggled with this aspect more than the technical details. Their pilots were brave and skilled, but they were trained to operate within doctrine. The American pilot had operated beyond doctrine, had made decisions in real time based on her assessment rather than waiting for authorization, and had succeeded. The decades following the Gulf War saw the A-10's reputation grow, even as various Pentagon officials periodically attempted to retire the aircraft in favor of newer, more sophisticated replacements. Every attempt was met with resistance from ground forces who had seen what the A-10 could do, from pilots who understood that survivability mattered more than sophistication, from maintainers who appreciated an aircraft designed to be repaired rather than replaced. Campbell's mission became an iconic example in these debates. When critics argued that modern warfare had moved beyond the A-10's capabilities, supporters would point to the photographs of her battle-damaged aircraft, to the hours she flew with manual controls, to the mission she completed despite catastrophic damage. The control stick she fought for that hour became a symbol not just of individual heroism, but of an entire design philosophy that valued survivability and redundancy over optimal performance. And so we return to that moment over Al-Khafji, to the explosion that should have ended everything, to the pilot who refused to accept that an aircraft could not be saved, to the control stick that moved when it should have been frozen. Campbell's hands gripped that stick with both arms, feeling the tremendous forces required to bank the aircraft, to maintain altitude, to execute the 100 small corrections necessary to keep flying. The stick, that should be light and responsive instead, fights back, demands attention, requires strength and determination to move. But it moves. It responds. The aircraft flies. The mission continues. This is what American engineering philosophy had prepared for. Not the expected failures, but the unexpected ones. Not the battles that go according to plan, but the ones that fall apart and demand adaptation. Soviet observers watching from their intelligence briefings see an aircraft that survived what should be unsurvivable, flown by a pilot who achieved what should be impossible, completing a mission that doctrine said should have been abandoned. They see evidence that American military culture has evolved to value different qualities than their own system prizes, that individual initiative and judgment are trusted at levels Soviet hierarchy would never permit, that equipment is designed around human capabilities rather than requiring humans to conform to equipment limitations. The control stick Campbell fights is not merely a flight control, but a physical manifestation of competing philosophies about warfare, engineering, and human capability. Soviet doctrine said, eject from fatally damaged aircraft. American doctrine said aircraft are fatally damaged only when they stop flying or the pilot gives up. Soviet engineering said design optimal systems that do not fail. American engineering said all systems fail. Design for graceful failure. Soviet training said operate within doctrine and procedures. American training said doctrine and procedures are starting points. Adapt as situations require. The difference was not that one side was right and the other wrong, but that they were optimizing for different scenarios, preparing for different kinds of wars, trusting in different sources of advantage. Campbell's mission proved that in the chaos of actual combat, where plans collapse and systems fail and survival depends on individual decisions made in seconds, the American philosophy of redundancy, initiative, and designed survivability could create victories from situations that should have been defeats. The control stick moves under her hands, grudging and heavy, but it moves, and that makes all the difference.